to another edition of Mjolnir and Movies Intermission with me, David Yorkshire. Now, as the other two are not here again, what I thought I would do is to review a film that I saw quite recently, actually, although the film is from 2018, so it's about 18 months old now, and that is an independent British film called Possum. And it's the debut of a comedian, actually, originally, and he's written it and directed it, called Matthew Holness. Now, I first came across Matthew Holness back in 2004 when I was one of the few people to actually watch his first effort, which was a television series that he wrote and starred in, which was called Garth Marenghi's Darkplace, which was on late night on Channel 4. And I latched onto it from the very first episode, really, because I kind of liked that sort of humour. It was very much a parody of horror stories, and particularly horror writers. The character of Garth Marenghi, which was played by Matthew Holness and also created by him, was basically a satire on people like Stephen King, specifically Stephen King really, but also other horror writers like James Herbert, I suppose, can be put into that bracket of these egotistical authors who are very full of themselves and think that they're creative geniuses when in fact they're just writing schlock shite. That's pretty much how he was portrayed anyway. Perhaps people will disagree with me on that, but personally I find Stephen King unreadable, and he certainly is nowhere near the level of someone like an Edgar Allan Poe, or particularly nowhere near the level of H.P. Lovecraft. And it was interesting, actually. I remember that one Stephen King called H.P. Lovecraft the macabre's dark and baroque prince. Prince, of course, because he regarded himself as king. You know, I'm Stephen King, the king. And this is sort of parodied in Garth Marenghi's Darkplace. But what I realised was that actually Matthew Holness knew an awful lot about the horror genre, because the series really relied on the fact that you knew a lot about the horror genre and the macabre and all its attendant spin-offs and so on. And in particular, the show was based on something that Stephen King took on, which was a miniseries called Kingdom Hospital, which was based on another series by Lars von Trier called The Kingdom, which was based in a hospital. And often, I watched this again back when it first aired back in 1994, which I believe was late night on BBC Two in this case, and it almost seemed like a parody itself at times, and probably was in part, but I don't think that Stephen King ever got that. And when he did it, it was certainly made into the usual Stephen King schlock affair. But Matthew Holness always struck me as being a very knowledgeable chap on literature, and particularly horror literature. And I saw an interview with him where he said that he very much liked horror writers and literary horror writers like M.R. James and J. Sheridan Le Fanu. And those two writers I particularly enjoyed when I was younger, and probably still would if I reread them. But the thing about those two writers is that they're very much in the British tradition of horror. Sheridan Le Fanu is Irish, as I remember, and M.R. James very much English. And you have a great sense of the British tradition specifically, but also the European tradition in general. and in fact, as I remember, the Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu character was a guy called Dr. Hestelius, and he was from the Scandinavia or something like that, his central character. And so very much, you know, northwestern European tradition. M.R. James, quintessentially English, particularly the landscapes as well, always struck me as very important in M.R. James's literature. And you got a lot of remoteness, that kind of thing. And this very much comes out in Matt Holness's film that he created, Possum. And Possum has a very big sense of bleakness to it. The landscape is deliberately extremely bleak because the central character is a very bleak character, and I got that straight away. He very much presents that and does it very well. There are aspects of psychological horror in there, and the psychological horror internalized into the central character is very much reflected in the landscapes as well as. And the central character is played by Sean Harris, who I'll be honest, I'd not come across him before, but he's played excellently. And I'd better sort of start with a bit about the plot and so on before I continue. So if you want to watch the film now, because there will be spoilers from here on in, and I do recommend that you watch the film actually, because it's I do recommend it as a film. I don't recommend it highly, which we will go into, why not, but I do recommend it. I think it's a very good film. Now, Sean Harris, as I say, he plays this puppeteer called Philip, and the central idea is that he's obviously had some kind of mental breakdown. He's come back home on the train with his puppet, and it is an incredibly grotesque puppet, which you don't see for about the first 20 minutes of the film or something like that. So there is that level of suspense there, because you want to see the puppet, of course, that is created. And it is quite a grotesque and horrible puppet with spider's legs and a doll's head almost, and it's very unsettling. Not really because of the specific horror aspect here, but you realize that there's something wrong with this central character for him to have created this puppet. And it is slowly revealed that he is very much haunted by the abuse he suffered as a child at the hands of his uncle, and he comes back to his old house in this remote village where his uncle resides. So his uncle is actually living in the house that his parents have left to him. His parents have died in a fire. They died when he was very young, and the uncle quite obviously abused him when he was a child. And the uncle is played by Alan Armstrong. Now Alan Armstrong, now again, fantastic actor. He's one of those people, one of those actors who you immediately say, oh yeah, it's him, and then can't remember what he's been in. but he's been in pretty much everything, and you realize he's been in absolutely everything, but can't seem to place where you know him from. But he's also his performance is extremely strong too, and that's about it for the central characters. Now, there is a plot line where there is a child who the central character Philip sees on the train in the beginning, and he follows him and asks him what he's drawing, because he's drawing, and Philip also likes to draw, but he draws particularly horrific things, and particularly his childhood drawings, and so he sort of connects with that, because the idea is, of course, he connects with him because he has this idea that he might have been abused too. And then from there on, this child goes missing, and we don't know if Philip has abducted that child or not. We also get some classic tropes of horror, particularly these motifs of the puppet coming alive and stalking the puppeteer and so on. But this is done in a different way, and you realize the logic behind that towards the end, that basically the puppet is him. This comes from a Freudian idea of the uncanny, where the inner sort of fears and darkness and so on is projected onto an object, thing or person. And he was very open about this in an interview, Matthew Holness, that's where he had the ideas from. Although Freud himself basically ripped off these ideas in any case from people like E.T.A. Hoffman, who again was a horror writer very famous for The Sandman, in which also you get this puppet, or rather automaton, as a central figure in that novel. Now, where it differs as well from the classic trope of the puppet coming alive and so on, is that what we're looking at actually is not really because it's always in the end of these films where the puppeteer and the puppet confront each other, and and there's a conversation, and remember in the episode of the Twilight Zone and so on, they generally change places or something like that. But this asks the question, what comes next? What comes next when there is that confrontation with the puppet and the mental breakdown of the puppeteer? And what you realize, of course, at the end is that the puppet is following him. He can't, he tries to throw the puppet away, but it keeps coming back, because essentially it's him. The puppet is an exterior, it's an extension, an externalization of his inner psyche, the tortured inner psyche. And it's wonderfully directed. It may be too slow for many people as a film. That is it a criticism? I don't really know. I certainly found it difficult at times. I think that Holness maybe judged the pacing a little off. I can see what he was trying to do in terms of artistry. I can see that he was portraying the bleakness and so on, and this building of atmosphere and tension. But I think he may have overcooked it a little bit, and so that is a criticism, I suppose. Well, you'll see what you think, but certainly I think that it gets a bit too slow at times. However, the biggest criticism I have is at the end. Now, what you've had throughout this film is a big lack of dialogue, because the central character, in being a victim of abuse, is very insular, very isolated, very reserved, very removed, and so on. And so that is the reason for the lack of dialogue. But equally, artistically, you also have a lack of dialogue, because one of the things that Holness wanted to do was to create a modern-day silent film. And so he reduced dialogue down to a minimum and played up atmosphere instead. And it works very well, because you have a reason for the lack of dialogue. And so he very much uses techniques by the German expressionists, and he's very much influenced by German expressionism, as he himself has said. However, the problem with that is that at the end he actually does the reverse, and when you have the big revelation, which I'm afraid I'm going to give away now, so I hope you've watched it, and it's the uncle who's abducted this child who is seen at the beginning, and you have this huge expose by the uncle on how he did it, almost like a sort of terribly written episode of Columbo or something like that, where the the killer just completely breaks down and confesses to everything and so on, and how he did it, and goes on far too long. And that is a huge flaw, actually, in that you have an explanation of everything by this uncle as he's attacking young Philip, or rather not so young Philip now, you know, he's in his mid-40s at this point. But the uncle, and it's not Alan Armstrong's fault, he's done everything asked of him in the script. I'm afraid here it's Matthew Holness's fault, and it's a bit of bad writing there. He should have explained less, because we don't need it anyway. It's rather insulting to the viewer's intelligence here. He's basically underestimating the average viewer who would watch this, who I think to watch a film like this demands a certain degree of intelligence in any case. And so he's failed a little bit there, but on the whole, I do think that this is a film that is worth watching, and so I commend it to you. And it is very much a film in the European tradition, very much based on the European macabre tale, despite its Freudian elements, although again, as I say, he's really taking the Freudian elements that were stolen from people like E.T.A. Hoffman in any case. So I think that this is a worthy film to watch, and certainly one thing that you will notice is that the entire of the cast are white European, and that is very rare in a film these days that has a very much European themes, European landscapes, and European characters. And so I commend that to you. So please leave a like for me finding that little gem for you. Thank you very much, and share this too. Bye for now.